My name is Patricia Caldwell. I'm 64 years old, and yesterday I walked into Meridian Financial Solutions as the new majority owner, the same company that tried to force me into retirement just 6 months ago, the same building where I'd spent 37 years climbing from junior accountant to senior vice president of operations, the same conference room where 3 smug executives told me my time was up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a woman they thought was finished became their worst nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It started on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember because I'd worn my Navy Armani suit, the one I saved for important presentations. I had a meeting with the executive committee to discuss the Henderson acquisition, a deal I'd been orchestrating for 8 months. $200 million of pure strategic genius that would expand our West Coast operations and secure our market position for the next decade. I'd worked weekends, missed my book club meetings, even skipped my granddaughter's piano recital to make those numbers work. The email came at 7:43 a.m. Subject line: Urgent meeting, HR Conference Room B, 9 a.m. Sender: Margaret Thornfield, Director of Human Resources. The same Margaret who'd started as my assistant 15 years ago, who I'd mentored through her MBA program, who used to bring me homemade cookies during her early days in HR. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it was probably just another compliance review or benefits update. I arrived 5 minutes early, as always. Margaret was already there, along with 2 people I didn't recognize immediately. A tall man in an expensive suit with silver hair and cold gray eyes, and a younger woman with a tablet and the demeanor of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret looked uncomfortable, avoiding my gaze as she gestured to the chair across from them. "Patricia, thank you for coming. Please, sit down." Her voice was different, formal, distant. The silver-haired man introduced himself as Richard Blackstone, representing the board of directors. The woman was Jennifer Walsh, legal counsel. My chest tightened. Board representation and legal counsel, for what should have been a routine HR meeting. "Patricia," Richard began, sliding a folder across the table, "we need to discuss your transition timeline." Transition timeline. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. I opened the folder. The first document was titled Mandatory Retirement Policy, Executive Level Positions. My eyes scanned the page, but the words seemed to blur together. Mandatory retirement at age 65. Effective immediately upon reaching said age. Non-negotiable company policy as of the recent board resolution. "I don't understand," I said, though part of me already did. "My birthday isn't until December. 8 months away." Jennifer Walsh leaned forward, her voice crisp and rehearsed. "The board has decided to implement an early transition period for affected executives. This allows for proper knowledge transfer and succession planning." Affected executives. As if age was some kind of disease. "The Henderson deal," I said, finding my voice. "I'm in the final stages of negotiation. The closing is scheduled for next month." Richard's smile was patronizing. "We appreciate your dedication, Patricia, but the board feels it's time for fresh perspectives on major acquisitions. Marcus Webb will be taking over your responsibilities." Marcus Webb. 38 years old with an MBA from Wharton and exactly 0 experience with acquisitions of this magnitude. Marcus Webb, who'd called me the office mom at last year's Christmas party. Marcus Webb, who still asked me how to format pivot tables in Excel. "I've given 37 years to this company," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've generated over $500 million in revenue through strategic acquisitions. My performance reviews have been exemplary. And we're grateful for your service." Margaret finally spoke, though she still wouldn't meet my eyes. "The retirement package is quite generous. Full pension, healthcare coverage, and a substantial severance bonus." Service. Like I was some retiring secretary who'd answered phones for 4 decades. I flipped through the rest of the documents. The severance package was indeed substantial, but it came with conditions. A non-compete clause that would prevent me from working in the financial sector for 2 years. A confidentiality agreement that would prohibit me from discussing any company business, strategies, or relationships with competitors. Essentially, they were buying my silence and ensuring I couldn't take my expertise elsewhere. What if I refuse? I asked. The room went silent. Jennifer Walsh exchanged a glance with Richard before responding. The board has voted to make retirement mandatory at 65 across all executive positions. This isn't negotiable, Patricia. However, if you choose not to accept the package, the company would be forced to pursue termination for cause. Termination for cause. They'd manufacture some reason to fire me, destroy my reputation, and leave me with nothing. I need time to think about this. Of course, Richard said, standing. We'll need your decision by Friday. That gives you 3 days. 3 days to decide whether to accept their generous offer to disappear quietly or fight them and lose everything. I walked back to my office in a daze. 37 years of memories lined the walls. Awards, certificates, photos from company retreats and acquisition celebrations. My assistant, Carol, looked up with her usual bright smile. How did the meeting go? I forced a smile. Just routine HR stuff. Hold my calls for a bit, would you? I closed my office door and sank into my leather chair. The chair I'd saved for 3 years to buy when I was promoted to VP. The chair that had witnessed countless negotiations, strategic planning sessions, and late-night work sessions that built this company into what it was today. My phone buzzed. A text from my daughter Sarah. Mom, are you free for lunch Saturday? Emma wants to show you her science project. Emma. My 10-year-old granddaughter, who thought I was the smartest person in the world. Who'd been planning to follow in Grandma Patty's footsteps and become a businesswoman. What would I tell her? That companies throw away people like old furniture when they decide you're too old to be useful? I spent the rest of Tuesday in meetings, putting on my professional mask while my mind raced. The Henderson deal was my masterpiece. I'd identified the target company, built relationships with their leadership, structured the financing, and navigated regulatory hurdles. Now Marcus Webb would walk in and claim credit for my work. That evening, I drove to my townhouse in silence. I'd bought the place 5 years ago after my divorce from Robert. 3 bedrooms, a home office, and a garden where I'd planned to spend my retirement years. But 64 wasn't retirement age. It was barely past middle age for someone who took care of herself, stayed sharp, and had more energy than executives half her age. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my living room, staring at the folder they'd given me. The words, "Mandatory Retirement," seemed to mock me from the cover page. I'd always believed that competence and results mattered more than age. I'd been naive. Wednesday brought more of the same corporate theater. People who'd worked under me for years suddenly couldn't maintain eye contact. Marcus Webb strutted around like he'd already inherited my kingdom. Margaret avoided me entirely, taking a different route to her office to prevent any chance encounters. But it was the conversation I overheard that really opened my eyes. I was in the supply room, gathering materials for a presentation, when I heard voices from the adjacent conference room. The door was slightly ajar, and I recognized Richard Blackstone's voice immediately. The Caldwell situation should resolve itself by week's end. Once she's gone, we can...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Restructure her entire division. Another voice, younger, probably Marcus Webb. What about the Henderson deal? She's been pretty possessive about the details. Richard laughed. Patricia's old school. Everything's documented in her files. Besides, how complicated can it be? We'll close the deal and take the credit. And her team? Half of them are approaching retirement age anyway. We'll clean house over the next 2 years. Bring in younger talent at lower salaries. The board projects we'll save $12 million annually in salary and benefits. $12 million. That's what 37 years of institutional knowledge and experience was worth to them. Not the revenue I'd generated or the deals I'd closed, but how much money they'd save by replacing me with someone younger and cheaper. I quietly backed away from the supply room, my hands shaking with rage. This wasn't just about me. They were planning to systematically remove every experienced executive and replace us with inexperienced but cheaper alternatives. It was age discrimination on a massive scale, disguised as corporate restructuring. Thursday night, I called my attorney, David Morrison. David had handled my divorce and estate planning, but I needed to know my options. Patricia, I'll be honest with you. Age discrimination is illegal, but it's extremely difficult to prove. Companies have learned to be sophisticated about it. The mandatory retirement policy, the generous severance package, the non-compete clause, they've covered their bases legally. So I just accept it? Fighting it could take years and cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees. Even if you win, do you really want to work for a company that treated you this way? He was right, but that didn't make it easier. Friday morning arrived like a death sentence. I had until 5 p.m. to accept their offer or face termination. I spent the morning reviewing my files, particularly the Henderson acquisition documents. 37 years of experience had taught me to keep copies of everything, and I'd been meticulous about documentation. At 4:30 p.m. I walked into Margaret's office with my decision. "I'll accept the package," I said, placing the signed documents on her desk. Relief flooded her face. "Patricia, I want you to know this wasn't personal. The board mandate came from above my head." "Of course it did." She handed me another folder. "Your last day will be next Friday. That gives you a week to transition your responsibilities and clean out your office. 1 week to dismantle 37 years of work. 1 week to hand over my life's achievements to people who saw me as nothing more than an expensive liability." But as I walked back to my office, something had shifted inside me. The rage was still there, but it was crystallizing into something colder, more focused. They thought they were discarding an old woman who'd accept their generous crumbs and fade quietly into retirement. They were wrong. Act 2, Discovery and Planning. The weekend after I signed my termination papers, I did something I hadn't done in 37 years. I turned off my phone, ignored my emails, and took a long drive through the countryside. I needed space to think, to process what had happened, and to figure out what came next. I ended up at a small cafe in the town where I'd grown up, 2 hours outside the city. The owner recognized me immediately. "Patricia Caldwell? My goodness, you haven't changed a bit since high school." Dorothy Martinez had been 2 years behind me in school. She'd bought this cafe 15 years ago after her husband died, turning it from a failing diner into a thriving local gathering spot. "What brings you back to Millfield?" she asked, pouring me coffee without asking. "Taking some time to think," I said. "Major life changes." We talked for 2 hours. Dorothy told me about the challenges of running a business, the long hours, the financial struggles in the early years. But she also talked about the satisfaction of building something from nothing, of being in control of her own destiny. "You know what the best part is?" she said as the afternoon crowd thinned. "Nobody can tell me I'm too old to do this job. If I want to work until I'm 90, that's my choice." Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about that phrase, my choice. For 37 years, I'd let other people make choices about my career, my value, my future. Even now, I was letting them dictate the terms of my exit. Monday morning, I started my final week at Meridian Financial. The transition meetings were insulting. Marcus Webb sat across from me with a notebook, asking elementary questions about deals I'd been managing for months. "So the Henderson acquisition," he said, pen poised like he was interviewing me for an entry-level position. "Walk me through the timeline." I wanted to laugh. Or scream. Instead, I gave him the basic overview, keeping the crucial details to myself. If they wanted my institutional knowledge, they should have treated me with respect. "What about the financing structure?" he pressed. "It's all documented in the files," I said. Which was true, but those files contained hundreds of pages of technical analysis that would take weeks to fully understand. By Wednesday, I was cleaning out my office. 37 years of accumulated materials, awards, and personal items. Carol helped me pack, tears in her eyes. "This isn't right, Mrs. Caldwell. You're the best executive this company has ever had." "Thank you, Carol. That means more than you know." As I packed my personal files, I made sure to keep copies of everything related to the Henderson deal. Not to sabotage the acquisition, but because I'd spent 8 months of my life on it, and I wanted proof of my work. Call it professional pride. Thursday evening, I was having dinner with Sarah and Emma when my granddaughter asked the question I'd been dreading. Grandma Patty, why are you retiring? You always said work was fun. Sarah gave me a warning look. We'd agreed not to burden Emma with the details. Sometimes companies want to bring in new people with fresh ideas, I said carefully. Emma frowned. But you have good ideas. You're always helping me with my projects. Sometimes it's not about having good ideas, sweetheart. Sometimes it's about other things. That's stupid, Emma declared with 10-year-old certainty. Emma, Sarah scolded, but I held up my hand. You know what, Emma? You're absolutely right. It is stupid. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Dorothy's cafe, about Emma's indignation, about the conversation I'd overheard in the conference room. They weren't just discarding me. They were planning to systematically remove every experienced executive and gut the institutional knowledge that had built Meridian Financial into an industry leader. I got up and made coffee, then sat at my kitchen table with my laptop. On impulse, I started researching Meridian Financial's ownership structure. It was something I'd never really investigated in detail. As an employee, I'd focused on operations, not corporate governance. What I found was fascinating. Meridian Financial was privately held, but not by a traditional board of directors. It was owned by a complex web of investment entities and holding companies. The largest shareholder was Blackstone Capital Management, Richard's firm, which held 42% of the company. The remaining 58% was divided among 17 smaller investment groups and individual shareholders. I spent hours tracing the ownership structure, cross-referencing SEC filings and corporate records. By 3 a.m., I had a clearer picture. Blackstone Capital had been systematically buying shares from smaller investors over the past 5 years, consolidating control. But they didn't have a true majority. They controlled the company through a combination of their large stake in strategic alliances with 3 other investment groups. More importantly, I discovered that 8 of the smaller shareholders were individuals, not investment firms. People who'd bought shares when the company went private 20 years ago and had simply held on to them. Some were former employees who'd received stock options. Others were early investors who'd believed in the company's potential. Friday was my last official day. There was a small farewell reception in the conference room, the same conference room where they delivered my termination notice 6 days earlier. Margaret made a brief speech about my years of service and dedication. Richard Blackstone wasn't there, which was probably for the best. Marcus Webb presented me with a crystal paperweight engraved with the company logo and my years of service. The same generic gift they'd given every retiree for the past decade. Thank you for everything you've taught me, he said with what I assumed was meant to be sincerity. I smiled and accepted the paperweight graciously. After all, I was supposed to be the grateful retiree, fading quietly into irrelevance. But that weekend, I started making phone calls. The first call was to David Morrison, my attorney. David, I need you to research something for me. How difficult would it be to acquire shares in a privately held company? Depends on the company's structure and whether current shareholders are willing to sell. Why? I explained what I'd discovered about Meridian Financial's ownership structure. Interesting, he said. You're thinking of becoming an investor in your former company? I'm thinking of becoming a significant investor, maybe even a controlling investor. There was a long pause. Patricia, that would be extremely expensive and complicated. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars, minimum. I have resources, David, more than you might think. Which was true. 37 years of careful saving, wise investments, and living below my means had left me financially secure. My divorce settlement from Robert had been substantial, including his share of several real estate investments. The severance package from Meridian would add another $2 million. But David was right. Acquiring a controlling stake in Meridian would require far more than my personal resources. The second call was to my investment advisor, Thomas Chen. Patricia, I'm sorry to hear about the retirement situation. Are you looking to adjust your portfolio for a more conservative approach? Actually, Thomas, I'm looking to do something rather aggressive. I want to explore acquiring a significant stake in a private company. I explained my situation and my research into Meridian's ownership structure. It's possible, Thomas said thoughtfully. You'd need to identify shareholders willing to sell, negotiate purchase prices, and arrange financing. The trickiest part would be doing it quietly to avoid driving up the price. How quietly? You could use shell corporations and nominee arrangements to mask your identity as the purchaser. It's completely legal, just discreet. The third call was to an old colleague, Janet Reeves. Janet had left Meridian 5 years ago to start her own consulting firm specializing in mergers and acquisitions. We'd worked together on dozens of deals over the years. Patricia! I heard about the forced retirement. I'm so sorry, that company doesn't deserve you. Thank you, Janet. Actually, I'm calling because I might have an interesting opportunity for you. I outlined my plan in general terms. Janet was intrigued. It's ambitious, she said. And expensive. But if anyone could pull it off, it's you. You know that company inside and out. I'd need help, someone with M&A expertise and connections to potential investors. I'm in, Janet said without hesitation. When do we start? Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the project with an intensity I hadn't felt in years. Every morning, I'd wake up with renewed purpose. This wasn't about revenge, exactly. It was about justice. About proving that experience and competence still mattered. About showing them that discarding seasoned executives was a costly mistake. Janet and I worked methodically. We identified the 17 minority shareholders and began researching their backgrounds, financial situations, and potential motivations for selling. We developed financial projections showing how much we'd need to acquire a controlling stake. We researched financing options, including private equity partnerships and asset-backed loans. The numbers were staggering. To gain majority control, we'd need to acquire at least 9% additional shares, which would cost an estimated $45 million based on the company's current valuation. Even with my personal resources and potential financing, it seemed impossible. But then Janet had a breakthrough. Patricia, I've been digging into the shareholder records, and I found something interesting. 3 of the individual shareholders are former employees who received stock options in the 1990s. All 3 are now retired and in their 70s. I think they might be interested in selling. She was right. Robert Hemley, former head of IT, owned 3% of the company. Maria Santos, former head of marketing, owned 8%. And incredibly, George Brennan, the company's former CEO who'd retired 12 years ago, owned 1%. George Brennan, I said. I remember him. He left because the board wanted to bring in younger leadership. Sound familiar? Janet asked dryly. I called George that afternoon. At 76, he was still sharp and immediately interested in my situation. They pushed you out for being too old? Patricia, you're 64. I've got ties older than that. We met for coffee the next day. George was a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes that hardened when I told him about the mandatory retirement policy. I saw this coming, he said. Richard Blackstone has been systematically taking control of companies and gutting their experienced leadership. It's all about maximizing short-term profits at the expense of long-term stability. Would you be interested in selling your shares? I asked carefully. George leaned back in his chair, studying me. Patricia, I've watched that company deteriorate under Blackstone's influence. The culture I spent 20 years building is disappearing. If you're planning what I think you're planning, I'm not just interested in selling you my shares. I want to be part of it. By the end of our conversation, we had the framework of a partnership. George would sell me his 1% stake at a fair market price, but he'd also provide financing and strategic advice. More importantly, he had relationships with other former employees and investors who might be willing to sell. Within 2 weeks, we'd secured verbal commitments from 6 individual shareholders representing 7% of the company. Combined with my planned purchases, we'd have 7% of Meridian Financial. But we needed more for actual control. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Carol, my former assistant, called me one evening. Mrs. Caldwell, I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I know you're retired now, but but I thought you'd want to know what's happening at the company. What's happening, Carol? They're firing people. Mr. Webb is cleaning house in your old division. He's let go of 6 people this week, all of them over 50. They're calling it restructuring, but everyone knows what it really is. My blood ran cold. They weren't waiting 2 years to implement their age purge. They were doing it now. Who else is being targeted? Pretty much anyone over 45. Word is they want to reduce the average age in the company by 10 years within 18 months. After I hung up with Carol, I sat in my kitchen feeling sick. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These were people I'd worked with for decades. Colleagues who'd devoted their careers to building Meridian Financial into an industry leader. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every experienced professional who'd been discarded because some corporate board decided they were too expensive or too old to be valuable. I called Janet immediately. "We need to accelerate the timeline," I said. "They're moving faster than we anticipated." "What happened?" I told her about the mass firings. "Jesus," Janet whispered. "Patricia, if we're going to do this, we need to do it now, before they destroy everything you built there." "Then let's do it." The next morning, I liquidated half of my investment portfolio. Janet arranged bridge financing from 2 private equity firms she'd worked with previously. George Brennan provided additional backing and agreed to come out of retirement to help with the transition. By the end of March, exactly 1 month after my forced retirement, we were ready to make our move. Act 3: Execution and Confrontation. The beauty of our plan was its simplicity. While Richard Blackstone and his board were focused on their systematic purge of experienced employees, we were quietly acquiring the shares they didn't think mattered. The individual investors and former employees were happy to sell to what they believed were unrelated investment entities. Our shell corporations and nominee arrangements kept my identity completely hidden. Janet coordinated the purchases with surgical precision. On Monday, we acquired Robert Henley's 2.3% stake through Sterling Investment Partners, a Delaware corporation we'd established. Tuesday brought Maria Santos's 1.8% through Pacific Holdings LLC. By Thursday, we'd secured agreements with 4 more individual shareholders. The key purchase came on Friday. George Brennan officially sold his 4.1% stake to Meridian Holdings Corporation, another of our shell entities. To any outside observer, it looked like George was simply cashing out his retirement investment to an unrelated buyer. By Friday evening, we controlled 14.2% of Meridian Financial Solutions. But we weren't done. Janet had identified 3 investment groups that held smaller stakes and might be interested in selling for the right price. More importantly, she'd discovered that one of Blackstone Capital's supposed allies, Hartwell Investments, was actually growing uncomfortable with the aggressive cost-cutting measures. The partner I spoke with at Hartwell was very careful with his words. Quote, Janet reported during our Saturday morning strategy session in my kitchen. But reading between the lines, they're concerned about the long-term impact of removing so much institutional knowledge. They invested in Meridian because of its stable, experienced leadership. How much does Hartwell control? 6.8%. Not huge individually, but combined with what we have, it puts us at 21%. George, who'd been quietly reviewing financial projections on his laptop, looked up. 21% still isn't control. Blackstone has 42% plus their other allies. True, Janet said, but it's enough to force changes. More importantly, it's enough to demand board representation and voting rights on major decisions. I stood up and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the garden I'd planned to tend in my retirement. The tulips were just beginning to bloom, pushing through the soil with determined persistence. I don't want to just demand changes, I said finally. I want control. I want them to experience what it feels like to have their life's work dismissed by people who don't understand its value. Over the next 2 weeks, we executed what Janet called Operation Tulip, named after those flowers pushing through seemingly impossible barriers. We approached Hartwell Investments directly, this time revealing my involvement and our broader strategy. The meeting was held at Hartwell's downtown offices. Janet, George, and I sat across from their 2 managing partners, David Hartwell and Sandra Reyes. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. David said after we'd presented our proposal. You're Patricia Caldwell, the former senior VP who was forced into retirement last month? That's correct. And you're attempting to acquire a controlling stake in the company that just terminated you? I prefer to think of it as acquiring a controlling stake in the company I helped build for 37 years. Sandra leaned forward. What's your endgame here? This seems like an expensive way to get revenge. It's not about revenge, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. It's about preserving the institutional knowledge and experienced leadership that made Meridian Financial successful. Blackstone Capital is systematically destroying everything that gave this company its competitive advantage. By firing older employees, David said flatly. By firing experienced employees regardless of their performance or value to the company. Age is just their excuse. The partners exchanged glances. Sandra spoke first. We've been concerned about the direction Blackstone has been taking the company. The quarterly reports show cost savings, but we're worried about long-term stability. What are you proposing specifically? David asked. Janet opened her briefcase and pulled out a detailed presentation. We're proposing a strategic alliance. Hartwell's 6, 8% combined with our 14. 2% gives us 21%. We add 3% more through additional acquisitions, and we have 24%. Still not majority control, but significant enough to demand board representation and voting rights on major strategic decisions. And then? Then we wait, George said. Blackstone's aggressive cost-cutting is going to hurt the company's performance. When the problems become apparent, other shareholders will start looking for alternatives. You think you can eventually gain majority control? I think we can gain enough control to restore responsible leadership, I said. Leadership that values experience and institutional knowledge. The meeting lasted 3 hours. In the end, Hartwell Investments agreed to join our coalition, bringing our total holdings to 21%. But it was the conversation after the formal meeting that changed everything. As we were gathering our materials, Sandra Reyes pulled me aside. Patricia, there's something else you should know. We've heard rumors that Blackstone is planning to take the company public within the next 2 years. IPO preparations are already underway. My mind raced. If Blackstone took Meridian public, they'd dilute all existing shareholders and potentially cash out their own stake at a massive profit. It would be the ultimate validation of their cost-cutting strategy, regardless of the long-term damage to the company. How solid are these rumors? Solid enough that they've engaged Goldman Sachs for preliminary discussions. That changed everything. We couldn't wait for Blackstone's strategy to fail naturally. We had to force their hand now, while Meridian was still privately held and vulnerable to a coordinated shareholder revolt. That evening, I called an emergency meeting of our coalition. We gathered at George's house, a beautiful Victorian in the historic district that reflected the success of his own business career. If they're planning an IPO, we have maybe 6 months to gain control, Janet said, pacing around George's living room. After that, they'll have access to public markets and unlimited capital. What would we need for actual majority control, I asked. George had been running calculations on his tablet. 51%. At current valuations, that's about $130 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. $130 million was beyond anything we'd contemplated. I could liquidate everything, I said slowly. My entire portfolio, the house, everything. That might get me to $25 million. Patricia, George said gently, even if we all liquidated everything, we couldn't raise that kind of money. What about private equity? Janet suggested. Firms that specialize in hostile takeovers? Possible, but then we're just replacing one corporate overlord with another. We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside it was starting to rain, drumming against George's windows with increasing intensity. Then I had an idea. What if we don't need majority control? What if we just need to create enough chaos to force Blackstone into a corner? Explain, Janet said. We have 21%. We demand board representation and voting rights. We use those rights to block every major decision Blackstone tries to make. We turn board meetings into public relations disasters. We force them to defend their age, discrimination policies in front of other shareholders and potential IPO investors. George was nodding slowly. Corporate guerrilla warfare. Exactly. We make it so expensive and difficult for them to operate that they're forced to negotiate with us. Or they could just buy us out, Janet pointed out. At what price? We're not some corporate raider looking for a quick profit. We're former employees and investors who care about the company's long-term success. If they want to buy us out, they'll have to pay premium prices and commit to policy changes. The more we discussed it, the more feasible it seemed. We didn't need to win a complete victory. We just needed to be enough of a threat to force meaningful changes. 2 weeks later, we filed formal notice with Meridian Financial's board of directors, requesting an emergency shareholder meeting and demanding representation proportional to our 21% stake. The response was swift and predictable. Richard Blackstone called me personally at 8 a.m. the following Monday. "Patricia, what exactly do you think you're doing?" "Exercising my rights as a shareholder, Richard." "You're not a shareholder. You're a disgruntled former employee trying to cause trouble." "Actually, Richard, I'm a significant shareholder with legal rights and legitimate concerns about the company's direction." There was a long pause. "I don't know what game you're playing, but it won't work. The board will never accept your demands. Then we'll see you in court. And in the business press. I'm sure potential IPO investors will be very interested in reading about Meridian Financial's systematic age discrimination policies." I heard him take a sharp breath. "You signed a confidentiality agreement." "I signed a confidentiality agreement as a terminated employee. As a shareholder, I have different rights and responsibilities, including the right to raise concerns about corporate governance and potential legal liabilities." The line went dead. Apparently, Richard Blackstone didn't appreciate being reminded that corporate executives have to answer to their shareholders. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Friday. According to corporate bylaws, our 21% stake entitled us to 2 seats on the 7-member board. More importantly, it gave us voting rights on major strategic decisions. But the real confrontation came earlier than expected. On Wednesday morning, I was having coffee in my kitchen when the doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see a black sedan in my driveway and 2 men in expensive suits standing at my front door. I opened the door cautiously. "Patricia Caldwell?" The taller man showed me a business card. "I'm James Morrison, representing Blackstone Capital Management. This is my colleague, Robert Chen. We'd like to speak with you about your recent investment activities." I invited them in, curious about their approach. These weren't lawyers or corporate executives. They had the polished, aggressive demeanor of private investigators or corporate security specialists. "Ms. Caldwell," James began once we were seated in my living room, "my clients are prepared to make you a very generous offer for your shareholdings in Meridian Financial. I'm not interested in selling. You haven't heard the offer yet. We're prepared to pay 30% above current market value for your entire stake. That's roughly $27 million. $27 million. More than my net worth. Offered for shares I'd acquired for $18 million. That's a generous offer," I said carefully. "But I'm not interested." "Ms. Caldwell, let me be direct. My clients have done extensive research into your financial situation. You've liquidated significant assets to make these purchases. A $9 million profit would allow you to restore your portfolio and enjoy a very comfortable retirement." "Mr. Morrison?" I said, standing up to signal the end of our conversation. "I appreciate your client's offer, but my shares are not for sale. At any price." Robert Chen spoke for the first time. "Ms. Caldwell, perhaps you don't understand the complexities of what you're attempting. Corporate takeovers require substantial resources and expertise. Without both, shareholders can find themselves in very difficult legal and financial situations." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. They were suggesting that my actions could expose me to lawsuits or financial ruin. "Gentlemen, I've been navigating corporate complexities for 37 years. I'm quite comfortable with my position." After they left, I immediately called David Morrison, my attorney. "They're trying to intimidate you," he said after I described the visit. "It's a common tactic in hostile takeover situations. They want you to believe you're in over your head." "Am I? Patricia, you've done everything by the book. Your share acquisitions were legal, properly documented and conducted through legitimate corporate entities. They can't touch you legally. That evening, Janet called with disturbing news. Patricia, I just heard from my contact at Hartwell. Blackstone has been reaching out to other shareholders, trying to buy back shares at premium prices. How premium? 40 to 50% above market value. They're panicking. Good, that means we're having an impact. Maybe, but it also means they're serious about fighting us. If they buy back enough shares from other investors, they could dilute our influence. I spent that night reviewing our strategy and running financial projections. Blackstone's willingness to pay premium prices for shares suggested they saw our coalition as a genuine threat. But it also meant they had substantial resources to fight us. The next morning brought unexpected reinforcement. Carol called me at 7 a.m., her voice excited and slightly breathless. Mrs. Caldwell, something's happening at the office. Mr. Webb held an all-hands meeting yesterday afternoon. He announced another round of layoffs, but this time it backfired. What do you mean? 3 department heads walked out during the meeting, just stood up and left. Then this morning, Jennifer Walsh from legal submitted her resignation. And get this, she cited concerns about potential age discrimination lawsuits in her resignation letter. Jennifer Walsh, the same attorney who'd sat in that conference room 5 weeks ago and threatened me with termination for cause. Did she give specifics? Not in the official letter, but word is spreading that she's concerned the company's policies could expose them to massive legal liability. Apparently, she's been advising the board to reconsider the mandatory retirement policy, and they've been ignoring her. This was better than I'd hoped. Internal resistance was growing, and it was coming from unexpected sources. That afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number. Ms. Caldwell? This is Jennifer Walsh. I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. I was stunned. Not at all. Though I'm surprised to hear from you. I imagine you are. Ms. Caldwell, I owe you an apology. What happened in that conference room was wrong, and I should have spoken up. Why didn't you? There was a long pause. Because I was afraid for my own job. I'm 48 years old, divorced, with 2 kids in college. I couldn't afford to lose my position. And now? Now I realize that staying silent makes me complicit in something I can't live with. The mandatory retirement policy is just the beginning. They're planning to systematically remove anyone over 45 and replace them with younger, cheaper employees. Can you prove that? I have documentation. Emails, strategic planning documents, board meeting minutes. Everything. My heart was racing. Documentary evidence of systematic age discrimination would be devastating to Blackstone's position. Jennifer, what are you asking for? I want to help. I know you're trying to gain control of the company, and I think you're the only one who can stop what's happening there. We arranged to meet that evening at a small restaurant outside the city. Jennifer arrived with a briefcase full of documents that told a chilling story of corporate callousness. The planning documents revealed that Blackstone's strategy went far beyond simple cost-cutting. They were implementing what they called workforce optimization, which involved identifying employees over 45 who could be replaced with younger alternatives. The projected savings were substantial, but the human cost was devastating. Look at this, Jennifer said, pointing to a spreadsheet. They've created detailed profiles of every employee over 40. Performance ratings, salary levels, years until retirement, estimated replacement costs. It's like a shopping list of people to eliminate. How many people are we talking about? In the first phase, 67 employees. In the second phase, another 43. That's nearly a third of the company's workforce. I studied the documents, my anger growing with each page. These weren't just statistics. These were people I'd worked with for decades. Colleagues who'd helped build Meridian Financial into an industry leader. Why are you showing me this? Because you're the only person with the resources and motivation to stop it. Also because some of these documents might be useful in your shareholder campaign. Useful how? Evidence of mismanagement and potential legal liability. If you can demonstrate that Blackstone's policies expose the company to significant lawsuit risk, other shareholders might reconsider their support. Jennifer's documentation was exactly what we needed to transform our corporate guerrilla warfare into a legitimate governance challenge. Armed with evidence of systematic discrimination and the financial risks it created, we could present ourselves as responsible shareholders trying to protect the company's long-term interests. Friday's emergency board meeting was held at Meridian Financial's downtown headquarters. I arrived 30 minutes early, accompanied by Janet and George. We'd spent the previous evening rehearsing our presentation and anticipating potential challenges. The conference room was the same one where I'd received my termination notice 6 weeks earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me as I took my seat at the polished oak table, where I'd once been told my services were no longer needed. Richard Blackstone entered with 2 other board members I recognized, Charles Morton from Morton Investment Group and Sandra Phillips from Phillips Capital Partners. They were followed by Marcus Webb, who looked distinctly uncomfortable, and 2 attorneys I didn't recognize. Before we begin, Richard said without preamble, I want to state for the record that this meeting is highly irregular. The board does not recognize the legitimacy of your shareholding claims. David Morrison, my attorney, responded immediately. Mr. Blackstone, our clients' shareholdings have been properly acquired, documented, and registered. Any challenge to their legitimacy would need to be pursued through appropriate legal channels. George leaned forward. Richard, let's dispense with the theatrics. We're here as significant shareholders with legitimate concerns about the company's direction. You can work with us constructively, or you can explain to other investors why you're refusing to listen to shareholders who control 21% of the company. The meeting lasted 4 hours and was contentious from start to finish. We presented our concerns about the company's employment policies, the potential legal liabilities they created, and the long-term damage to institutional knowledge and competitive advantage. Richard's responses were predictably dismissive. The board has implemented necessary cost-saving measures to ensure the company's financial stability. Any suggestion of age discrimination is unfounded and irresponsible. That's when Janet played our ace. Actually, Mr. Blackstone, we have substantial documentation suggesting that cost-saving measures are, in fact, systematic age discrimination disguised as corporate restructuring. She opened her briefcase and distributed copies of Jennifer Walsh's documents. The room went silent as the board members reviewed the evidence. Charles Morton was the first to speak. Richard, what the hell is this, workforce optimization based on age demographics? Are you trying to get us sued into bankruptcy? Those documents are confidential internal planning materials taken without authorization, one of Blackstone's attorneys interjected. These documents, David Morrison replied smoothly, were provided by a concerned former employee who felt obligated to report potential illegal activity. They're protected under whistleblower statutes. The meeting devolved into legal arguments and heated exchanges. But by the end, we'd accomplished our primary objective, establishing ourselves as legitimate shareholders with serious concerns about corporate governance and legal liability. More importantly, we'd planted seeds of doubt among other board members about Blackstone's leadership and judgment. As we gathered our materials to leave, Richard Blackstone approached me directly. Patricia, this has gone far enough. You're destroying the company you claim to care about. No, Richard. You destroyed it when you decided that experience and institutional knowledge were liabilities instead of assets. I'm just trying to save what's left. Name your price. Whatever you want, we'll pay it. I looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd so casually dismissed 37 years of my professional life. My price isn't money, Richard. My price is your resignation and a complete reversal of your discriminatory employment policies. His face hardened. That's not going to happen. Then I guess we'll see you at the next board meeting. The following week brought a cascade of developments that exceeded our most optimistic projections. News of our shareholder challenge leaked to the business press, triggering a series of investigative articles about Meridian Financial's employment practices. The stories were devastating. Reporter Sarah Chen from the Business Journal had somehow obtained additional internal documents and interviewed several former employees who'd been forced into early retirement. Her 3-part series painted a damning picture of systematic age discrimination and corporate mismanagement. More importantly, the publicity attracted attention from other shareholders who'd been quietly concerned about the company's direction. Janet fielded calls from 3 more investment groups interested in joining our coalition. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On Tuesday morning, I received a call from someone identifying himself as Kevin Blackstone, Richard's younger brother. "Ms. Caldwell, I know this is unusual, but I'd like to meet with you. I have something you might find interesting." We met that afternoon at a coffee shop near the university. Kevin Blackstone was shorter than his brother, with kind eyes and a nervous demeanor that suggested he wasn't comfortable with whatever he was about to reveal. "Ms. Caldwell, I want you to know that I disagree completely with what Richard has done to you and the other employees. It's wrong, and it's destroying everything our father built when he founded the company." "Your father founded Meridian Financial? 45 years ago. He believed in treating employees with respect and building long-term value, not maximizing quarterly profits at the expense of everything else." Kevin explained that he owned 2% of Meridian Financial, inherited from their father. He'd been a silent shareholder for years, trusting Richard to honor their father's values. But what's happening now isn't what Dad envisioned. Richard's turning the company into a corporate chop shop. "What are you proposing?" "I want to sell you my shares, not for a profit, but at cost. I'd rather see someone who actually cares about the company's future, in control." Kevin's 2%, combined with our existing 21%, would give us 2%. Still not majority control, but a substantial enough stake to force significant changes in corporate governance. More importantly, Kevin had access to information about Blackstone Capital's financing arrangements and strategic plans. Richard's borrowed heavily to fund the share buyback program, he revealed. He's also committed to the IPO timeline regardless of the company's actual readiness. If the IPO fails or gets delayed, Blackstone Capital could face serious financial difficulties. This was the leverage we needed. If we could delay or derail the IPO by raising questions about the company's legal liabilities and management competence, we could force Blackstone into a corner. Over the next 2 weeks, our coalition grew to include 6 investment groups and individual shareholders controlling 28.7% of Meridian Financial. We had enough influence to block major strategic decisions and demand significant changes in corporate governance. But Blackstone wasn't surrendering without a fight. On a Thursday morning in early May, I was working in my garden when I noticed a van parked across the street. 2 men sat inside, occasionally pointing cameras in my direction. Private investigators, almost certainly hired by Blackstone to document my activities and look for any legal vulnerabilities. I called David Morrison immediately. "It's legal as long as they stay on public property," he confirmed. "But it suggests they're getting desperate. People don't hire private investigators unless they're planning something." The something became clear the following Monday. I arrived at my mailbox to find a thick legal envelope from Hartman Baker & Associates, attorneys representing Blackstone Capital Management. Inside was a cease and desist letter demanding that I stop making, quote, "false and defamatory statements about Meridian Financial's employment practices." The letter threatened immediate legal action if I continued to, quote, "interfere with normal business operations through harassment and intimidation of employees and shareholders." I called David immediately. "It's a scare tactic," he said after reviewing the letter. "They're trying to silence you by threatening expensive litigation. But they don't have a case. Everything you've said has been factually accurate and protected as shareholder communication. So I ignore it? We respond appropriately. Let me draft a reply explaining that your actions are protected shareholder activities and that any attempt to silence legitimate corporate governance concerns could constitute shareholder oppression." That afternoon, Janet called with more concerning news. "Patricia, I just heard from my contact at Hartwell. Blackstone has been approaching major institutional investors about a private placement offering. They're trying to raise capital by selling new shares to friendly investors, which would dilute our holdings." Exactly. If they sell enough new shares to institutional allies, they could reduce our influence below the threshold needed to force board changes. We were running out of time. Blackstone was fighting us on multiple fronts: legal intimidation, private investigators, and now financial maneuvers designed to dilute our shareholdings. That evening, I called an emergency meeting of our entire coalition. We gathered at George's house again, but this time the mood was tense rather than optimistic. "We need to force a confrontation," I announced after explaining the latest developments. "No more gradual pressure or legal maneuvering. We need to demand an immediate special shareholders meeting and call for a vote of no confidence in current management." "That's a nuclear option," warned Sandra Reyes from Hartwell Investments. "If we lose, Blackstone will have a mandate to ignore us completely. If we don't act now, they'll dilute our holdings and eliminate our influence anyway." George was nodding slowly. "Patricia's right. We've been playing defense, but defense doesn't win corporate battles. We need to go on the offensive." Janet opened her laptop and began pulling up corporate governance statutes. A special shareholders meeting requires signatures from shareholders controlling at least 25% of the company. We have 28.7%, so we can force the meeting. "What about the vote itself?" asked Kevin Blackstone. "A vote of no confidence would be symbolic unless we can demonstrate actual malfeasance or breach of fiduciary duty," David Morrison explained. "But it would be devastating from a public relations standpoint, especially with the IPO timeline. We have the documentation from Jennifer Walsh," I pointed out. "Systematic age discrimination definitely qualifies as breach of fiduciary duty." The more we discussed it, the more feasible it seemed. A special shareholders meeting would force every investor to take sides publicly. Even if we didn't win the vote, we could use the platform to present our evidence and damage Blackstone's credibility with potential IPO investors. We scheduled the meeting for Friday, June 15th. Under corporate bylaws, we had to provide 30 days notice, which gave Blackstone time to mount a defense but also gave us time to build support among other shareholders. The next morning, we filed formal notice with the Delaware Secretary of State and served papers on Meridian Financial's board of directors. The special meeting would address 2 agenda items: a vote of no confidence in current management and a resolution requiring board approval for any new share issuances. Blackstone's response was swift and predictable. By Wednesday, they'd retained Morrison & Fitzgerald, one of the city's most expensive corporate law firms. By Friday, they'd filed a motion in Delaware Chancery Court, seeking to block the special meeting on procedural grounds. But the real battle was being fought in the press, and among other shareholders. Sarah Chen's continued coverage in the Business Journal had attracted attention from other media outlets. By the second week of May, Meridian Financial's employment practices were being scrutinized by reporters from the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and several trade publications. The stories weren't just about age discrimination anymore. Reporters had uncovered evidence of questionable accounting practices, conflicts of interest in vendor relationships, and concerning executive compensation arrangements. Marcus Webb, who'd been so eager to take over my responsibilities, was struggling under the increased scrutiny. The Henderson acquisition, which should have closed in April, had been delayed twice due to due diligence issues that I could have resolved in minutes. But the development that changed everything came from a completely unexpected source. On a Tuesday morning in late May, I received a call from Emma, my 10-year-old granddaughter. "Grandma Patty, are you famous? Mom says you're in the newspaper." I laughed despite my stress. "Not famous, sweetheart. Just dealing with some work problems." "The mean people who said you were too old?" "Something like that." "Well, I think they're stupid. You're the smartest person I know." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about Emma's simple assessment of the situation. Out of the mouths of babes. That afternoon, Sarah contacted me for another interview. During our conversation, she mentioned something that made me reconsider our entire strategy. "Ms. Caldwell, I've been researching Blackstone Capital's other investments. They've implemented similar workforce optimization programs at 3 other companies in the past 5 years. In each case, they've subsequently sold the companies at substantial profits. You think they're planning to sell Meridian Financial? I think the IPO is just the first step. Once they've used public markets to inflate the valuation, they'll probably sell to a larger financial services company." This reframed everything. Blackstone wasn't just discriminating against older employees. They were systematically destroying institutional knowledge and corporate culture to maximize short-term profits before selling the company. The employees they were firing weren't just victims of age discrimination. They were casualties of a corporate asset-stripping operation designed to make Meridian Financial attractive to potential acquirers who cared more about cost structure than competitive advantage. That evening, I called Jennifer Walsh. "Jennifer, I need to ask you something. In all your interactions with the board, did you ever hear discussions about selling the company after the IPO?" There was a long pause. Not explicitly, but there were references to strategic alternatives and maximizing shareholder value through various exit strategies. Exit strategies. Patricia, now that you mention it, there were several meetings with investment bankers that I wasn't allowed to attend. At the time, I assumed they were related to the IPO planning. But they could have been about something else. They could have been about selling the company, yes. This was the missing piece of the puzzle. If we could prove that Blackstone was planning to sell Meridian Financial after using public markets to inflate its value, we could argue that their entire strategy was designed to benefit themselves at the expense of employees, shareholders, and the company's long-term prospects. The special shareholders meeting was now 3 weeks away. We had enough evidence to make a compelling case, but we needed to present it in a way that would resonate with institutional investors who cared more about returns than employee welfare. Fortunately, Jennifer Walsh's documentation included financial projections showing the long-term costs of Blackstone's workforce optimization program. The elimination of experienced employees would save money in the short term, but would likely result in higher training costs, reduced productivity, and increased employee turnover. More importantly, the systematic removal of institutional knowledge would make the company vulnerable to competitive threats and regulatory challenges that experienced employees would have anticipated and prevented. We spent the final 3 weeks before the special meeting building support among shareholders who hadn't yet taken sides. George leveraged his relationships with former employees and board members. Janet reached out to institutional investors who might be concerned about long-term value preservation. I focused on individual shareholders who might be sympathetic to employee welfare issues. The responses were encouraging but not overwhelming. Many shareholders appreciated our concerns but were reluctant to oppose management without stronger evidence of financial mismanagement. That's when Marcus Webb made the mistake that changed everything. On June 10th, 5 days before the special meeting, Marcus announced that the Henderson acquisition had fallen through. The deal I'd spent 8 months negotiating, the deal that would have secured Meridian Financial's West Coast expansion, had collapsed due to what he called irreconcilable differences in strategic vision. I knew immediately what had happened. Marcus had tried to renegotiate terms without understanding the delicate relationship dynamics I'd carefully cultivated with Henderson's leadership team. His inexperience and arrogance had destroyed a deal worth over $200 million. The business press coverage was brutal. Sarah Chen's article was headlined, "Meridian Financial Loses Major Acquisition Due to Management Inexperience." The story detailed how the replacement of experienced executives with younger, less experienced alternatives had directly resulted in the deal's collapse. More damaging was the quote from Henderson's CEO. "We were looking forward to working with Patricia Caldwell, who understood our business and shared our long-term vision. Her replacement seemed more interested in extracting immediate value than building sustainable partnerships." The failed acquisition crystallized everything we'd been arguing about the value of experience and institutional knowledge versus short-term cost savings and management inexperience. On June 15th, shareholders representing over 90% of Meridian Financial's outstanding shares gathered in the company's largest conference room for the special meeting that would determine the company's future. Act 4. Resolution and Transformation. The special shareholders meeting began at 9 a.m. sharp in Meridian Financial's executive conference room. I arrived 30 minutes early with Janet, George, and David Morrison, my attorney. We'd rehearsed our presentation countless times, but I still felt nervous energy coursing through my system. The room filled quickly with faces I recognized, and many I didn't. Richard Blackstone sat at the head of the table with his legal team, looking confident despite the circumstances. Marcus Webb was notably absent, probably trying to avoid questions about the failed Henderson acquisition. The meeting was chaired by Charles Morton from Morton Investment Group, the most senior independent board member. He called the session to order with obvious reluctance. This special meeting has been called by shareholders representing 28.7% of outstanding shares to address two resolutions: a vote of no confidence in current management and restrictions on new share issuances without shareholder approval. I stood to address the room, my heart pounding but my voice steady. Fellow shareholders, 6 months ago I was Patricia Caldwell, Senior Vice President of Operations. Today I'm Patricia Caldwell, concerned shareholder and advocate for responsible corporate governance. I didn't choose this transformation. It was forced on me by management policies that prioritize short-term cost savings over long-term value creation. I presented our evidence methodically. Jennifer Walsh's documentation of systematic age discrimination. The financial projections showing the long-term costs of eliminating experienced employees. The failed Henderson acquisition as proof that inexperience has real consequences. This isn't about one terminated employee seeking revenge, I concluded. This is about shareholders protecting their investment from management decisions that are destroying the company's competitive advantages. Richard Blackstone's response was predictably defensive. He characterized our challenge as the bitter complaints of a disgruntled former employee and dismissed our evidence as taken out of context. The board has implemented necessary modernization strategies to ensure Meridian Financial's competitiveness in an evolving marketplace. Any suggestion that these lawful business decisions constitute discrimination is both false and irresponsible. But when Kevin Blackstone stood to speak, the dynamic in the room shifted dramatically. My father founded this company 45 years ago with the belief that experienced, dedicated employees were our greatest asset. What's happening now isn't modernization. It's the systematic destruction of everything he built. Kevin's testimony carried special weight because of his family connection and his obvious reluctance to oppose his own brother publicly. When he finished speaking, you could hear a pin drop in the conference room. The formal presentations took 2 hours. Then came the questions from other shareholders, and that's when Richard Blackstone's facade began to crack. Sandra Reyes from Hartwell Investments asked about the IPO timeline and whether the recent negative publicity would affect the offering. The IPO remains on track. Richard replied tersely, "These baseless allegations won't affect our plans." "What about the failed Henderson acquisition?" asked another shareholder. That was a significant strategic opportunity. The Henderson deal was terminated due to changing market conditions, not management inexperience. I couldn't let that stand. Mr. Blackstone, I have emails from Henderson's CEO stating explicitly that they terminated negotiations because they lost confidence in Meridian's new leadership team. Would you like me to read them to the group? Richard's face flushed. Those communications are confidential business matters. They're communications about a failed $200 million acquisition that resulted directly from your decision to replace experienced leadership with inexperienced alternatives. The tension in the room was palpable. Other shareholders were exchanging glances and whispering among themselves. Then came the question that changed everything. Robert Chen from Pacific Investment Partners stood up. Mr. Blackstone, there are rumors that Blackstone Capital is planning to sell Meridian Financial after the IPO. Can you confirm or deny these rumors? Richard hesitated for just a moment too long. Blackstone Capital is committed to maximizing shareholder value through all appropriate strategies. That's not an answer, Chen pressed. Are you planning to sell the company? All strategic alternatives remain under consideration. The room erupted. Shareholders who'd been quietly supportive of management began demanding specific answers about long-term plans and commitment to the company's independence. I realized this was our moment. Fellow shareholders, I said, standing again, you've just heard management admit that they're considering selling the company. Everything they've done, the employee terminations, the cost-cutting, the destruction of institutional knowledge, has been designed to make Meridian Financial attractive to potential buyers, not to build long-term value for existing shareholders. That's a gross mischaracterization, Richard protested. Then deny it. Tell us explicitly that Blackstone Capital has no plans to sell Meridian Financial within the next 5 years. Silence. Richard couldn't make that promise because he couldn't lie under oath in front of shareholders who could sue him personally for fraud. The vote of no confidence passed by a margin of 67%. Even some of Blackstone's traditional allies voted against management, unwilling to support executives who couldn't commit to the company's long-term independence. The resolution restricting new share issuances passed by an even larger margin, 74%. Shareholders were clearly concerned about dilution and wanted protection against financial manipulation. But the real victory came after the formal meeting ended. As shareholders filed out, several approached me directly. Pacific Investment Partners wanted to discuss selling their 4.2% stake. Morrison Investment Group was interested in forming a broader coalition. 2 individual shareholders offered to support any future governance initiatives. By the end of the day, our coalition controlled over 35% of Meridian Financial. More importantly, Richard Blackstone's credibility was destroyed. Within a week, 2 more board members had resigned, citing concerns about the company's direction. The business press coverage was devastating, with headlines like, "Meridian Financial Management loses shareholder confidence," and, quote, "Age discrimination scandal threatens IPO plans." The IPO was quietly postponed pending, quote, "resolution of governance issues." 3 weeks later, Richard Blackstone requested a private meeting. We met at a neutral location, a hotel conference room downtown. Richard arrived with only one attorney, a sign that he was ready to negotiate rather than fight. "Patricia, you've made your point. What do you want?" "I want you to resign. I want the mandatory retirement policy rescinded. I want all terminated employees over 50 offered their jobs back with full seniority. And I want a commitment that Meridian Financial will remain independent for at least 5 years. That's impossible. I can't just undo months of strategic planning. Then you'll continue to face shareholder opposition until you're forced out anyway, but that path will be much more expensive and public than this one." We negotiated for 3 hours. In the end, Richard agreed to resign as CEO but retain his board seat. The mandatory retirement policy would be rescinded immediately. Terminated employees would be offered reinstatement or enhanced severance packages. The company would commit to independence for 3 years, not 5. It wasn't everything I'd wanted, but it was a complete reversal of the policies that had destroyed so many careers. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning in July. Richard Blackstone was stepping down as CEO to pursue other opportunities. An interim CEO would be appointed while the board conducted a comprehensive search for permanent leadership. That afternoon, I received a call I'd been expecting. "Ms. Caldwell, this is Charles Morton. The UAU Tui Tenuel, the Greshkol, Comprehensert board would like to speak with you about serving as interim CEO while we conduct our search." I laughed. "Charles, 6 months ago you told me I was too old to be effective. What's changed?" "Experience has value," he said simply. "We've learned that the hard way." I accepted the interim position with conditions. I would serve for no more than 12 months. The board would commit to hiring a permanent CEO based on competence and experience, not age. And the company would implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies covering all protected classes. On Monday, August 15th, exactly 5 months after my forced retirement, I walked back into Meridian Financial as interim CEO. The building looked the same, but everything felt different. Employees who'd been demoralized and fearful were suddenly energized and optimistic. Carol, my former assistant, cried when she saw me walk through the lobby. My first official act was calling an all-hands meeting in the main conference room. 6 months ago, I was told that my experience and institutional knowledge were liabilities. Today, I'm back as your interim CEO, because the board has learned that experience and institutional knowledge are actually our greatest assets. The applause was thunderous. Some of you lost your jobs because of discriminatory policies. Some of you lived in fear that you'd be next. That era is over. Meridian Financial will once again be a company that values experience, competence, and dedication over age demographics and cost calculations. Over the next month, I focused on rebuilding what Blackstone's policies had destroyed. 23 of the terminated employees accepted offers to return. The Henderson acquisition was revived after I personally called their CEO and rebuilt the relationship. The company's culture slowly began to heal, but the most satisfying moment came 6 weeks into my interim tenure. Marcus Webb requested a meeting to discuss his future with the company. He sat across from my desk, the same desk I'd been forced to clean out 5 months earlier. "Ms. Caldwell, I know I made mistakes. The Henderson deal, the way I handled the transition, everything. I was in over my head." "Yes, you were. I'd like the chance to learn from those mistakes. To work under experienced leadership and develop the skills I obviously lack." I studied his face, looking for signs of the arrogance that had characterized his early interactions with me. Instead, I saw humility and genuine regret. "Marcus, the question isn't whether you made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The question is whether you learned from them, and whether you're willing to put the company's interests ahead of your own ambitions. I am. I want to be part of building something sustainable, not just advancing my own career." I offered him a position as Senior Vice President of Strategic Development, reporting directly to me. It was a significant role, but one that would require him to rebuild his credibility through demonstrated competence, rather than corporate politics. The permanent CEO search took 8 months. The board ultimately selected Sarah Chen, the Business Journal reporter who'd broken our story. Sarah had spent 15 years in financial journalism before earning her MBA and transitioning to corporate strategy. At 42, she brought both experience and fresh perspectives to the role. My last day as interim CEO was April 30th, exactly 1 year after my forced retirement. The board threw a reception in my honor, but the moment that mattered most was a private conversation with Emma, my granddaughter. "Grandma Patty, are you retiring for real this time?" "Yes, sweetheart, but on my own terms." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm choosing to step down because I've accomplished what I set out to do, not because someone else decided I was too old to be useful." I did retire eventually, but not to the quiet garden retirement I'd originally planned. Instead, I started a consulting firm, specializing in corporate governance and age discrimination issues. Janet became my business partner, and George serves on our advisory board. We help other companies avoid the mistakes Meridian Financial made. We work with employees facing age discrimination. And occasionally, we help shareholder groups challenge management decisions that prioritize short-term profits over long-term value. The work is satisfying in ways I never expected. Not because it's about revenge or proving a point, but because it's about ensuring that experience and institutional knowledge are valued rather than discarded. 6 months after stepping down as interim CEO, I received a letter from Kevin Blackstone. Richard had quietly resigned from all his board positions and sold his remaining stake in Meridian Financial. Blackstone Capital was focusing on other investments. "You accomplished something I never thought possible," Kevin wrote. "You saved the company our father built without destroying the people he cared about. Thank you." But the letter that meant the most came from someone unexpected. "Dear Ms. Caldwell," it began. "You don't know me, but I'm Robert Henley, former head of IT at Meridian Financial. I was one of the first employees forced into early retirement under the mandatory policy. I just wanted you to know that what you did gave me hope again. Not just for myself, but for all of us who thought our careers were over just because we'd reached a certain age. You showed us that experience still matters, and that sometimes fighting back is worth the risk. Thank you for not going quietly." I framed that letter and hung it in my home office, next to the crystal paperweight Marcus Webb had given me on my last day as a terminated employee. Sometimes I look at those two items, bookends to a year that transformed my understanding of corporate loyalty, personal power, and the true meaning of retirement. I learned that retirement isn't about age or company policies or other people's definitions of when you're no longer useful. Retirement is about choosing when you've accomplished what you set out to do and when you're ready to move on to the next chapter. I also learned that fighting back doesn't always mean seeking revenge. Sometimes it means standing up for principles that are larger than your own grievances. Sometimes it means protecting other people who don't have the resources or platform to protect themselves. The consulting firm I established Caldwell Strategic Advisors, grew faster than I'd anticipated. Within 6 months of leaving Meridian Financial, we had 12 clients and a waiting list of companies seeking guidance on governance issues and workplace discrimination prevention. What started as a personal mission had evolved into something much larger. Our offices occupied the top floor of a renovated brick building in the Arts District, deliberately chosen for its contrast to the sterile corporate towers where I'd spent most of my career. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the space with natural light, and we'd furnished it with comfortable seating areas that encouraged open conversation rather than formal presentations. Janet had proven to be an exceptional business partner. Her background in mergers and acquisitions complemented my operational expertise, and her network of contacts provided a steady stream of referrals. George's role as senior advisor gave us credibility with older executives who might otherwise be skeptical of a consulting firm founded by someone who'd just fought a very public battle with her former employer. But it was our fourth team member who brought an unexpected dimension to our work. Jennifer Walsh had joined us 3 months after leaving Meridian Financial, bringing not only her legal expertise but also her insider knowledge of how companies rationalize discriminatory practices. Her experience on both sides of employment law made her uniquely qualified to help organizations identify and address systemic problems before they became legal liabilities. "The thing people don't understand," Jennifer explained during one of our weekly strategy meetings, "is that most companies don't set out to discriminate. They make decisions that seem logical in isolation but create discriminatory patterns when viewed collectively." She was reviewing a case that had come to us from Hartwell Investments. One of their portfolio companies, a regional bank, was experiencing an exodus of experienced loan officers. The bank's leadership claimed it was natural turnover, but Hartwell suspected something more troubling. "Look at the data," Jennifer continued, spreading financial reports across our conference table. "Over the past 18 months, they've lost 47% of their loan officers over age 50. The official reason is always voluntary resignation or mutual separation, but the pattern is clear." I studied the documents while sipping my morning coffee. The numbers told a story I'd seen before: experienced employees being systematically pushed out through policy changes that made their jobs untenable, while maintaining plausible deniability about discriminatory intent. "What's the mechanism?" I asked. "New performance metrics that favor quantity over quality. Digital systems that replace institutional knowledge with algorithmic decisions. Compensation structures that reward speed rather than accuracy." George leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses. "Classic modernization discrimination. Make the job incompatible with experience and expertise, then claim older workers can't adapt." This case represented exactly the kind of challenge that motivated our work. The bank wasn't breaking any laws overtly, but they were creating conditions that effectively eliminated experienced employees while appearing to pursue legitimate business objectives. Our investigation took 3 weeks and involved interviewing 22 current and former employees, analyzing 5 years of performance data, and reviewing all policy changes implemented since the current management team took control. The pattern was unmistakable. Every policy change had been justified as necessary modernization, but the cumulative effect was the systematic elimination of the bank's most experienced loan officers. These were people who understood local market conditions, had relationships with longtime customers, and could identify loan risks that algorithms missed. The human cost was devastating. Maria Rodriguez had worked at the bank for 28 years, building a portfolio of small business clients who trusted her judgment and relied on her expertise. Under the new performance metrics, her careful analysis and relationship-building approach was penalized because it took longer than automated processing. "They wanted me to approve or deny loans in 15 minutes, Maria told us during a tearful interview at her kitchen table. "How do you evaluate a family business's potential in 15 minutes? Some of my best clients would have been rejected under the new system. David Park had been the bank's top commercial loan officer for 15 years, before the policy changes made his position impossible. His specialty was complex real estate financing that required deep understanding of zoning laws, market trends, and development potential. The new system could only handle standard residential mortgages and simple business loans," David explained. "Everything else was supposed to be referred to the regional office, But the regional office didn't understand our local market. They were rejecting deals that I knew were solid investments. The bank's financial performance data confirmed what these interviews suggested. Despite management's claims about improved efficiency, the bank's loan portfolio quality had declined significantly. Default rates were up 32%, and customer satisfaction scores had dropped to the lowest levels in the bank's history. More troubling, the bank was losing market share to competitors who continued to employ experienced loan officers capable of handling complex transactions and building customer relationships. When we presented our findings to Hartwell Investments, the response was immediate and decisive. This isn't just a legal liability, Sandra Reyes concluded after reviewing our report. It's a business disaster disguised as modernization. The bank's board of directors was presented with our findings and given 30 days to develop a remediation plan. The plan would need to address both the discriminatory policies and the declining business performance they'd caused. But not every case we handled had such clear resolution. Some companies were too entrenched in their discriminatory practices to change, even when presented with compelling evidence of both legal risks and business consequences. TechVantage Solutions was a software development firm that had grown rapidly by acquiring smaller companies and consolidating their operations. On the surface, their business model seemed sound. Acquire companies with valuable intellectual property, integrate their technologies, and eliminate redundant positions to improve efficiency. In practice, their integration process systematically eliminated older employees while retaining younger ones, regardless of relative competence or contribution to company success. The case came to us through a referral from David Morrison, my attorney. 3 former TechVantage employees had contacted him about potential age discrimination claims, but the individual cases were difficult to prove without broader pattern evidence. Our investigation revealed a troubling pattern across 7 acquisitions over 4 years. In each case, TechVantage had implemented "cultural integration" programs that effectively pushed out employees over 45, while claiming to prioritize innovation and agility. The mechanism was sophisticated. Rather than direct layoffs, TechVantage would reassign older employees to projects with impossible deadlines, unrealistic expectations, or incompatible skill requirements. When these employees inevitably struggled or resigned, their departures were documented as performance-related or voluntary. Lisa Chang had been a senior software architect at Dataflow Systems when TechVantage acquired her company. At 52, she had 26 years of experience and had led the development of Dataflow's most successful products. They assigned me to a mobile app project and gave me 3 weeks to learn programming languages I'd never used, Lisa explained during our interview. When I asked for training or additional time, they said the timeline was non-negotiable and suggested I might not be a good fit for the new company culture. James Mitchell had been Dataflow's head of quality assurance, responsible for ensuring software reliability and security. TechVantage eliminated his position entirely, claiming that automated testing tools made human oversight unnecessary. 6 months later, they had a major security breach that cost them millions in customer penalties, James noted bitterly. The breach happened because their automated systems missed vulnerabilities that any experienced QA professional would have caught immediately. The financial impact of TechVantage's age discrimination was significant, but hidden within the complexity of multiple acquisitions and integrations. When we analyzed the data carefully, the pattern became clear. Acquired companies consistently experienced declining performance metrics after their experienced employees were eliminated. Customer satisfaction dropped. Product quality suffered. Development timelines increased rather than decreased. But TechVantage's leadership attributed these problems to normal integration challenges, rather than recognizing them as consequences of systematic knowledge elimination. When we presented our findings to TechVantage's board, the response was predictably defensive. Our integration methodology is based on industry best practices, CEO Brian Foster insisted. Any suggestion that we discriminate against employees based on age is both false and defamatory. The board meeting was held in TechVantage's glass-walled conference room, surrounded by motivational posters featuring young, diverse employees and slogans about innovation and disruption. The irony of discussing age discrimination in that environment wasn't lost on me. "Mr. Foster," I replied calmly. Were he calmly not making accusations? We're presenting data that shows concerning patterns in your employment practices and their impact on business performance. I walked them through our analysis methodically. In 7 acquisitions, TechVantage had eliminated an average of 68% of employees over 45 within 18 months. The official reasons varied, but the result was always the same: the systematic removal of institutional knowledge and experience. These employees weren't failing to meet performance standards, Jennifer Walsh added. They were meeting different performance standards than their younger colleagues. Standards that seemed designed to justify their elimination. The legal implications were serious. While individual cases might be difficult to prove, the pattern across multiple acquisitions created strong evidence of systematic discrimination that could expose TechVantage to significant liability. But Brian Foster remained dismissive. The technology industry moves fast. Companies that don't adapt get left behind. Our approach ensures we're working with people who can keep up with rapid change. George Brennan leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in business leadership. Mr. Foster, I've been in technology longer than you've been alive. The most successful technology companies are those that combine innovation with experience. You're not adapting to change, you're destroying the knowledge base that makes change sustainable. The meeting ended without resolution. TechVantage's board chose to reject our recommendations and risk the legal and business consequences of continuing their discriminatory practices. 6 months later, TechVantage faced a class action lawsuit filed by 37 former employees across multiple acquisitions. The case eventually settled for $12 million. But the damage to TechVantage's reputation and business relationships was far greater. More importantly, the case became a cautionary tale that we used in presentations to other companies about the real costs of age discrimination disguised as business strategy. These experiences taught me that corporate age discrimination wasn't an isolated problem affecting individual companies. It was a systemic issue that reflected broader cultural attitudes about aging, technology, and business value. The technology industry was particularly problematic, but the attitudes that drove discrimination existed across sectors. Financial services companies eliminated experienced traders and analysts in favor of algorithmic systems. Healthcare organizations pushed out veteran nurses and administrators to reduce labor costs. Manufacturing firms replaced skilled technicians with automated systems and younger workers willing to accept lower wages. In each case, the justification was similar: modernization, efficiency, cost reduction, cultural transformation. But the result was always the same: the systematic elimination of knowledge, experience, and institutional memory that took decades to develop and couldn't be easily replaced. This realization led us to expand our mission beyond individual cases to broader industry education and policy advocacy. We began speaking at business conferences, writing articles for trade publications, and working with professional associations to raise awareness about the business costs of age discrimination. The response was encouraging but mixed. Some executives genuinely didn't realize their policies were discriminatory and were grateful for guidance on how to avoid legal and business problems. Others were defensive about practices they knew were problematic, but considered necessary for competitive reasons. The most challenging cases involved companies where age discrimination was so embedded in corporate culture that changing it would require fundamental transformation of management philosophy and business practices. Global Corp Manufacturing was one such company. They'd contacted us after receiving a complaint from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission about their early retirement incentive programs, but their real motivation was avoiding legal liability rather than addressing underlying problems. The company's leadership team was remarkably young for an organization with 60 years of operational history. The average age of their executives was 38, and they took pride in what they called their dynamic, forward-thinking culture. During our initial consultation, Chief Human Resources Officer Amanda Stevens, who was 34, explained their challenge with obvious frustration. "We're not discriminating against anyone," she insisted. "We offer generous early retirement packages to employees who want to transition out of the workforce. It's completely voluntary." The early retirement packages were indeed generous in financial terms, But they came with deadlines and conditions that made them coercive rather than truly voluntary. Employees over 55 were given 90 days to accept the packages or face reassignment to positions with reduced responsibilities and compensation. It's a business necessity, Amanda continued. Our industry is changing rapidly, and we need people who can adapt to new technologies and processes. Older workers often struggle with change. Jennifer Walsh and I exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of age-based stereotyping that created legal liability. But Amanda seemed genuinely unaware of the problem. Miss Stevens, Jennifer said carefully, can you provide data showing that older employees actually struggle more with technology adoption or process changes? Well, it's common sense, isn't it? Younger people grew up with technology. Common sense isn't a legal defense for employment decisions, I pointed out. If you're making assumptions about employee capabilities based on age rather than individual assessment, you're potentially violating federal discrimination laws. Our investigation of Global Corp revealed an organization that had confused youth with competence and change with improvement. The company had indeed modernized many of its operations, but they'd also eliminated crucial institutional knowledge about production processes, quality control, and customer relationships. Plant supervisor Roberto Martinez had worked at Global Corp for 31 years before accepting an early retirement package. At 57, he'd been responsible for the company's most complex manufacturing line, one that required deep understanding of materials, science, and precision engineering. They brought in a 28-year-old engineer to replace me, Roberto explained during our interview at his modest suburban home. Great kid, very smart, but he didn't understand why we did certain things certain ways. He wanted to optimize everything based on computer models. 6 months after Roberto's retirement, the manufacturing line he'd supervised experienced its first major quality failure in over a decade. The failure cost Global Corp $3 million in recalled products and damaged relationships with 2 major customers. The new supervisor followed the manual exactly, Roberto noted with sad satisfaction. But the manual didn't cover the exceptions and adjustments that experience teaches you to make. That's knowledge you can't download from a computer. Similar stories emerged from across Global Corp's operations. The company was struggling with increased quality problems, customer complaints, and production inefficiencies that directly correlated with the elimination of experienced employees. But when we presented these findings to Global Corp's leadership team, their response revealed how deeply age bias was embedded in their corporate culture. Transitional challenges are normal when implementing modernization programs, CEO Marcus Hoffman explained. Short-term disruptions are acceptable if they lead to long-term improvements. Mr. Hoffman, I replied, what evidence do you have that eliminating experienced employees will lead to long-term improvements? Younger employees are more adaptable, more innovative, more willing to embrace change. Based on what data? The question seemed to catch him off guard. It's well established that innovation comes from fresh perspectives and new approaches. George Brennan shook his head. Marcus, I've been in manufacturing for 45 years. The best innovations come from combining experience with fresh perspectives, not from eliminating experience entirely. The fundamental problem wasn't just legal compliance or business performance. It was a worldview that saw aging as inevitable decline, rather than accumulated wisdom and capability. This realization led us to develop a different approach to consulting work. Instead of simply identifying problems and recommending solutions, we began focusing on changing attitudes and assumptions about aging and work. We created workshops that brought together employees of different ages to work on real business challenges, demonstrating how generational diversity enhanced rather than hindered performance. We developed assessment tools that measured actual capabilities rather than making age-based assumptions. We helped companies create mentoring programs that leveraged experienced employees' knowledge while giving them opportunities to learn new skills. The most successful interventions involved changing organizational culture rather than just policies. Companies that truly valued age diversity created environments where experience was seen as an asset to be leveraged rather than a liability to be eliminated. Meridian Financial had become one of our best examples of successful cultural transformation. Under Sarah Chen's leadership, the company had implemented comprehensive age diversity initiatives that were showing measurable results. The company's new mentoring program paired experienced employees with younger colleagues for mutual learning. Senior loan officers taught relationship building and risk assessment skills while learning about digital marketing and social media customer engagement. Veteran project managers shared their knowledge of complex problem solving while getting training on new project management software and collaboration tools. The results were impressive. Employee satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs across all age groups. Customer satisfaction had improved significantly. Most importantly, the company's financial performance was exceeding industry benchmarks in markets where competitors were struggling. The key insight, Sarah explained during a case study presentation at a banking industry conference, was recognizing that age diversity is like any other form of diversity. It creates value when different perspectives and experiences are integrated effectively. But it creates problems when differences are seen as incompatible or threatening. This success story became a template we used with other clients, but it also highlighted how rare such enlightened leadership was in corporate America. Most companies were still operating under assumptions that equated youth with innovation and aging with obsolescence. These assumptions were deeply embedded in business culture and reinforced by media narratives about technological disruption and the need for organizational agility. Changing these attitudes required more than consulting work with individual companies. It required broader cultural and policy interventions that challenged ageist assumptions about work and value. This realization led me to become involved in policy advocacy work with organizations like AARP and the National Council on Aging. We worked on legislative initiatives to strengthen age discrimination enforcement and educational programs to raise awareness about the business case for age diversity. The work was satisfying but often frustrating. Progress was slow, and setbacks were common. For every company that embraced age diversity, there were others that continued discriminatory practices while finding new ways to rationalize them. But gradually, we began to see signs of broader change. Demographic realities were forcing companies to reconsider their assumptions about aging workers. As baby boomers delayed retirement and younger generations entered the workforce in smaller numbers, employers were discovering that they couldn't afford to eliminate experienced employees. More importantly, research was beginning to demonstrate the business value of age diversity. Studies showed that teams with generational diversity outperformed age-homogeneous teams on complex problem-solving tasks. Companies with strong age diversity policies had lower turnover rates and higher customer satisfaction scores. The consulting firm continued to grow, but my role evolved from day-to-day operations to strategic leadership and thought leadership. I spent more time writing, speaking, and advocating for policy changes that would make the experiences I'd lived through unnecessary for future generations of older workers. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work was mentoring other professionals who'd experienced age discrimination. Our firm had developed a pro bono program that provided consulting services to individuals and small groups who couldn't afford our regular fees. These cases reminded me constantly of why the work mattered beyond business performance and legal compliance. Age discrimination wasn't just an economic inefficiency or legal liability. It was a form of social injustice that destroyed lives and wasted human potential. Margaret Thompson was 61 when she contacted us after being forced into early retirement from her position as head librarian at a regional university system. The university claimed budget constraints required eliminating her position, but they'd immediately hired a 35-year-old replacement at a lower salary. I wasn't ready to retire, Margaret explained during our initial consultation. I loved my work, and I was good at it. The library system I'd built was serving more students and faculty than ever before. The university's justification was familiar: the need to modernize library services and attract tech-savvy younger users. But their actual motivation was simpler. Margaret's salary and benefits were expensive, and they believed a younger librarian could do the job for less money. Working within our pro bono program, Jennifer Walsh helped Margaret document the university's discriminatory practices and file a complaint with the EEOC. The case eventually settled for a substantial sum, but Margaret's real victory was being offered a consulting position to help other universities develop age-inclusive library services. I realized that my experience and knowledge were valuable, Margaret reflected 6 months after her settlement. The university tried to make me believe I was obsolete, but I wasn't. I just needed to find people who valued what I had to offer. These individual victories were deeply satisfying, but they also reinforced my understanding of how pervasive age discrimination had become in American workplaces. Every week brought new cases of qualified, experienced professionals being pushed out of jobs for reasons that had nothing to do with their performance or capabilities. The pattern was always similar. Companies would implement policies that appeared neutral but had discriminatory effects, then claim business necessity when challenged. The affected employees often struggled to prove discrimination because individual cases could be explained away as coincidental or performance-related. But when viewed collectively, the patterns were unmistakable. American businesses were systematically eliminating older workers while claiming to pursue legitimate business objectives. The result was a massive waste of human capital and institutional knowledge that had taken decades to develop. This waste wasn't just affecting individual employees. It was damaging American competitiveness by eliminating the deep expertise and institutional memory that distinguished successful companies from their competitors. As my consulting work evolved into broader advocacy, I began to see the fight against age discrimination as part of a larger struggle about how society values experience and wisdom in an era of rapid technological change. The assumption that newer is always better, that disruption is always positive, that youth is inherently more valuable than experience was creating not just workplace discrimination but broader social problems. Companies that eliminated experienced employees often discovered that they'd also eliminated crucial knowledge about customer relationships, operational processes, and risk management that couldn't be easily replaced. The short-term cost savings were often offset by long-term performance problems and competitive disadvantages. But the most important lesson from 5 years of consulting work was that age discrimination was ultimately self-defeating. Companies that embraced age diversity and leveraged the full range of their employees' capabilities consistently outperformed those that pursued youth-obsessed modernization strategies. The challenge was convincing business leaders that their assumptions about aging and work were not only legally risky and morally wrong, but also economically irrational. This challenge became the central focus of my work as I approached my 70th birthday. I was no longer the angry former executive seeking justice for her own mistreatment. I'd become an advocate for systemic change that would benefit not just older workers, but the organizations and society that depended on their contributions. The transformation from victim to advocate hadn't been planned, but it felt like the natural evolution of everything I'd learned from fighting my own discrimination case. Personal justice had been important, but broader social change was the real prize. At 70, I had more energy and purpose than I'd felt in decades. The work was challenging, meaningful, and far from finished. There were still too many companies eliminating experienced employees. Too many older workers accepting discrimination as inevitable. Too many lost opportunities to leverage the full potential of American talent. But there was also growing recognition that age diversity was not just morally right, but economically smart. More companies were implementing inclusive practices, more older workers were fighting discrimination, and more policymakers were recognizing the need for stronger protections. The fight that had started with my own forced retirement had evolved into something much larger, a movement to change how American society thinks about aging, work, and value. It was exactly the kind of challenge that made retirement impossible to contemplate, no matter what any corporate policy might dictate. The morning of my 70th birthday brought an unexpected phone call that would reshape everything I thought I knew about corporate justice and personal vindication. The caller identified herself as Amanda Walsh, a producer for 60 Minutes, and she wanted to discuss featuring our work in a segment about workplace age discrimination. Ms. Caldwell, we've been following your story since the Meridian Financial case, and we think it represents something much larger happening in American businesses, Amanda explained. Would you be willing to participate in an investigative piece about systematic age discrimination in corporate America? The opportunity was both thrilling and terrifying. National television exposure could amplify our message and help countless older workers, but it would also subject every aspect of our work to intense scrutiny. What kind of access would you need? I asked carefully. We'd want to document your consulting work, interview some of your clients, and explore the broader patterns you've identified. We're particularly interested in the financial impact of age discrimination on both workers and companies. I agreed to a preliminary meeting, which led to 6 months of collaboration with the 60 Minutes team. The experience was unlike anything I'd anticipated when I first walked out of Meridian Financial 5 years earlier. The producers were thorough investigators who verified every claim and challenged every assumption. They interviewed dozens of people, former employees who'd experienced discrimination, executives who'd implemented problematic policies, researchers who'd studied workplace ageism, and legal experts who understood the regulatory landscape. What emerged was a comprehensive picture of how age discrimination had evolved, from isolated incidents to systematic practices that were costing American businesses billions of dollars in lost productivity, increased turnover, and litigation expenses. The segment aired on a Sunday evening in November, titled "The Age of Discrimination: How American Companies Are Wasting Their Most Experienced Workers." The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday morning, our consulting firm had received over 300 calls from individuals seeking help with discrimination cases. By Wednesday, we'd been contacted by 47 companies wanting to assess their own practices before problems developed. By Friday, I'd been invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee investigating workplace discrimination. The national attention brought both opportunities and challenges. Media appearances became a regular part of my schedule, which meant less time for direct consulting work, but more opportunities to influence policy discussions and corporate practices. One of the most significant developments came from an unexpected source. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a researcher at Stanford Business School, contacted me about collaborating on a comprehensive study of age diversity and corporate performance. "The anecdotal evidence you've gathered is compelling," she explained during our first meeting at her campus office. "But we need rigorous academic research to convince skeptical executives and policymakers." The study took 18 months and involved analyzing data from over 400 companies across 12 industries. The results exceeded even my optimistic expectations about the business case for age diversity. Companies with strong age diversity policies consistently outperformed their peers on multiple metrics. They had lower employee turnover, higher customer satisfaction scores, better financial performance, and fewer legal challenges. Most importantly, they demonstrated greater resilience during economic downturns and industry disruptions. "The data is unambiguous," Dr. Chen concluded in her presentation to the Academy of Management. "Age diversity isn't just socially responsible, it's economically advantageous. Companies that discriminate against older workers are literally throwing away competitive advantages." The Stanford study provided the academic credibility our consulting work had lacked. Suddenly, we were being invited to speak at business schools, industry conferences, and corporate retreats. The message was resonating with executives who might have dismissed anecdotal evidence but couldn't argue with peer-reviewed research. But the real validation came from watching companies implement meaningful changes based on our recommendations. Hartwell Investments had become one of our most successful case studies. After working with us to address problems at their portfolio companies, they developed comprehensive age diversity requirements for all their investments. We now evaluate management teams' age diversity policies as rigorously as we evaluate their financial projections, Sandra Reyes explained during a presentation to the Private Equity Association. Companies that discriminate against experienced workers are poor investments, regardless of their short-term financial performance. This approach was spreading throughout the investment community. Private equity firms, venture capital funds, and institutional investors were beginning to recognize that age discrimination represented both legal liability and business risk that could affect portfolio performance. The policy advocacy work was also bearing fruit. The congressional subcommittee hearing led to proposed legislation strengthening age discrimination enforcement and requiring companies to report demographic data about their workforce composition and employment practices. Testifying before Congress was simultaneously humbling and empowering. Sitting at the witness table in the Hart Senate Office Building, looking out at senators and representatives who would determine federal policy affecting millions of older workers, I felt the weight of representing everyone who'd experienced workplace age discrimination. Senator Williams. I responded to a question about the scope of the problem, Age discrimination isn't an isolated issue affecting a few unfortunate individuals. It's a systematic practice that's costing American businesses an estimated $47 billion annually in lost productivity, increased turnover, and litigation expenses. The numbers came from our Stanford collaboration and represented the most comprehensive analysis of age discrimination's economic impact ever conducted. The senators seemed genuinely surprised by the magnitude of the costs. Ms. Caldwell, Senator Rodriguez asked, "What would you recommend as the most effective intervention to address this problem?" "Education and enforcement working together," I replied. "Many executives don't realize their practices are discriminatory or economically counterproductive. But education alone isn't sufficient. We also need stronger enforcement mechanisms and meaningful penalties for companies that persist in discriminatory practices." The hearing generated significant media coverage and political momentum for stronger age discrimination protections. While legislative progress was slow, the increased attention was forcing companies to examine their own practices more carefully. This policy work connected me with advocates and researchers across the country who were fighting similar battles. I joined the advisory board of the Center for Age Equity, a think tank focused on workplace discrimination research and policy development. Through this network, I learned about innovative programs that were successfully addressing age discrimination in different industries and regions. Some companies had implemented wisdom transfer programs that paired experienced employees with younger colleagues for mutual mentoring. Others had created flexible career paths that allowed older workers to reduce their responsibilities gradually, rather than facing abrupt retirement deadlines. The most successful interventions seemed to involve changing organizational culture rather than just implementing compliance policies. Companies that truly valued age diversity created environments where experience was seen as complementary to innovation rather than incompatible with it. But not every story had a positive ending. Some of the cases that came to our attention involved such egregious discrimination that legal action was the only meaningful response. TechVantage Solutions, the software company that had rejected our recommendations 2 years earlier, had continued their systematic elimination of older employees until they faced a class action lawsuit involving over 60 former workers. The case went to trial, and I was called as an expert witness to explain the patterns we'd identified during our original investigation. Sitting in federal court, reviewing the same evidence I'd presented to TechVantage's board years earlier, I felt both vindicated and sad that it had taken legal action to force changes that should have been obvious business decisions. The jury awarded the plaintiffs $18 million in damages, but the real victory was the court-ordered reform of TechVantage's employment practices. The company was required to implement comprehensive age diversity training, establish objective performance evaluation criteria, and submit to 5 years of federal monitoring. CEO Brian Foster, who'd been so dismissive during our original presentation, was forced to issue a public apology and commit to hiring an outside consultant to oversee the company's cultural transformation. These legal victories were important for establishing precedents and deterring other companies from similar practices, but I found greater satisfaction in prevention work that helped companies avoid discrimination problems entirely. Our consulting practice had evolved to focus primarily on proactive interventions rather than reactive crisis management. We worked with companies to identify potential discrimination risks before they became legal liabilities, developed training programs that changed attitudes rather than just conveying compliance requirements, and created assessment tools that measured actual capabilities rather than making age-based assumptions. The work was more complex than simply identifying problems and recommending solutions. Changing deeply embedded cultural attitudes about aging and work required sustained effort and sophisticated interventions that addressed unconscious bias, as well as explicit policies. One of our most innovative programs involved virtual reality simulations that allowed younger managers to experience workplace ageism firsthand. Participants wore VR headsets that aged their appearance and voice, then navigated job interviews and workplace interactions where they faced subtle and overt discrimination. "It's shocking how differently people respond to you when they perceive you as older," observed Marcus Webb, who'd volunteered to participate in the simulation during a Meridian financial training session. "I never realized how many unconscious assumptions I was making about people's capabilities based on their age." Marcus had become one of our most effective advocates within the business community. His transformation from the arrogant young executive who dismissed my experience to a thoughtful leader who championed age diversity demonstrated that attitudes could change when people were willing to examine their assumptions honestly. The virtual reality program was being implemented by dozens of companies and had become one of our most requested services. The technology allowed people to experience discrimination emotionally rather than just understanding it intellectually, which created lasting changes in behavior and decision-making. As our consulting practice matured, I began thinking about succession planning and long-term sustainability. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone who'd fought age discrimination was now planning her own transition from active leadership to advisory roles. But this transition felt completely different from the forced retirement I'd experienced at Meridian Financial. I was choosing the timing and terms based on my own priorities and energy levels rather than someone else's arbitrary policies or assumptions about age and capability. Jennifer Walsh had emerged as the natural successor to lead day-to-day operations. Her legal background, consulting experience, and passionate commitment to the mission made her an ideal choice to carry the work forward. "Patricia, you've built something that's bigger than any individual," Jennifer observed during one of our strategic planning sessions. "The challenge now is institutionalizing the knowledge and relationships you've developed so the work can continue and expand." We spent months documenting our methodologies, formalizing our training programs, and creating systems that would allow the consulting practice to operate without my direct involvement. The process was similar to the succession planning I'd always advocated for client companies, but more emotionally complex because it involved transferring work that had become deeply personal. The transition timeline we developed allowed for a gradual reduction in my operational responsibilities over 2 years, followed by an ongoing advisory role that would let me continue writing, speaking, and policy advocacy work without the administrative burden of running a consulting practice. But before beginning this transition, I wanted to complete one final major project that would consolidate everything I'd learned about age discrimination and workplace justice. The book project had been suggested repeatedly by publishers and literary agents who recognized the broader significance of our story. Initially, I'd been reluctant to spend time on writing when there was so much consulting and advocacy work to be done. But I'd come to realize that a comprehensive book could reach audiences we'd never influence through consulting work alone. It could provide a resource for individuals facing discrimination, a guide for companies wanting to improve their practices, and a call to action for policymakers and advocates working on systemic change. The writing process took 18 months and required revisiting painful memories as well as celebrating victories and transformations. Working with a professional writer who specialized in business narratives, I documented not just the Meridian Financial case, but the broader patterns and lessons we'd discovered through 5 years of consulting work. The Age Advantage: How America Can Stop Wasting Its Most Experienced Workers was published on the 6th anniversary of my forced retirement from Meridian Financial. The timing felt symbolically appropriate for closing one chapter of my life while opening another. The book tour provided opportunities to share our message with audiences across the country and connect with advocates and researchers working on similar issues. Every event reinforced my understanding of how widespread age discrimination had become, and how urgently American businesses needed to change their attitudes and practices. But the most meaningful response came from individuals who'd experienced discrimination and found hope and practical guidance in our story. The emails and letters were deeply moving testimonials to the importance of fighting back against injustice, even when the odds seemed impossible. "Dear Ms. Caldwell," wrote Robert Martinez, a former aerospace engineer who'd been forced into early retirement, "your book gave me the courage to file a discrimination complaint instead of accepting what happened to me as inevitable. I'm now working with an attorney and feel hopeful for the first time in 2 years." These personal connections reminded me that the work we'd done wasn't just about corporate policy or business performance. It was about human dignity and the right of experienced workers to be valued for their contributions rather than discarded because of their age. The book's success also created new opportunities for influence and advocacy. I was invited to join corporate boards specifically to provide expertise on age diversity and workplace equity issues. These positions allowed me to influence company policies from within rather than just consulting from outside. Serving on the board of Hartwell Investments had been particularly satisfying because it allowed me to help implement the age diversity requirements Sandra Reyes had described at the Private Equity Association. Every investment decision now included evaluation of portfolio companies, employment practices, and their commitment to leveraging workers of all ages. The board work also provided insights into how demographic changes were forcing companies to reconsider their assumptions about workforce composition and career trajectories. As baby boomers delayed retirement and younger generations entered the workforce in smaller numbers, employers were discovering that they couldn't afford to eliminate experienced workers. These demographic realities were creating market pressures that complemented our advocacy efforts. Companies that had discriminated against older workers were finding themselves facing labor shortages and knowledge gaps that were affecting their competitive performance. We're seeing a fundamental shift in how companies think about workforce planning, observed Dr. Chen during a conference panel we participated in together. Demographics are forcing businesses to confront the reality that age diversity isn't just morally right, it's economically necessary. This convergence of moral arguments and economic necessity was creating the most promising environment for systemic change that I'd seen in decades of business experience. Companies were finally beginning to understand that age discrimination was not just legally risky, but strategically self-destructive. The consulting practice Jennifer Walsh now led was fielding more requests for proactive assistance than reactive crisis management. Companies wanted help developing age-inclusive policies before problems developed, rather than after they'd been sued or publicly embarrassed. This shift represented exactly the kind of cultural transformation we'd been working toward. Instead of fighting discrimination after it occurred, we were helping prevent it by changing attitudes and practices before they caused harm. The transition to advisory roles had given me more time for writing, speaking, and policy work. But it had also created space for reflection on the broader significance of everything that had happened since that March morning, when I was told my services were no longer needed. The forced retirement that had seemed like a devastating end to my career had actually been the beginning of the most meaningful and impactful work of my professional life. The age discrimination that was intended to silence and marginalize me had instead given me a platform and purpose that reached far beyond anything I'd accomplished in 37 years of corporate employment. The irony was profound but not accidental. Systematic injustice often creates its own opposition by affecting people who have the resources, knowledge, and determination to fight back effectively. My experience at Meridian Financial had been traumatic, but it had also provided me with the motivation and credibility to challenge practices that were harming countless other workers. The personal transformation had been as significant as the professional impact. The woman who'd accepted forced retirement quietly might have enjoyed a comfortable but unremarkable retirement. The woman who'd fought back had discovered capabilities and purpose she'd never known she possessed. At 72, I had more energy and sense of mission than I'd felt in decades. The work was far from finished, but the progress was undeniable. Companies across America were implementing age-inclusive policies, workers were challenging discrimination more effectively, and policymakers were recognizing the need for stronger protections. The movement we'd helped start was gaining momentum and attracting new advocates and researchers who would carry it forward long after my own active involvement ended. The consulting practice, research initiatives, and policy advocacy efforts had created institutional capacity that could continue expanding regardless of any individual's participation. But perhaps the most important legacy was the demonstration that fighting back against injustice was possible, even when the odds seemed impossible and the opponents seemed invincible. Every person who challenged age discrimination, every company that implemented inclusive practices, and every policymaker who supported stronger protections was part of a larger transformation that was changing how American society thought about aging, work, and value. The story that had started with one woman's forced retirement had become a national conversation about workplace equity and human dignity. It was exactly the kind of impact that made every moment of struggle and uncertainty worthwhile. Standing in my home office, looking at the framed photographs that documented 6 years of advocacy and change, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from turning personal injury into social progress. The crystal paperweight Marcus Webb had given me during my termination reception still sat on my desk, But now it was surrounded by awards, thank you letters, and photographs from events where our work had made a difference. The woman who'd been told she was too old to contribute had spent the most productive years of her life, proving exactly the opposite. Age had brought not decline but wisdom, not limitation but liberation, not endings but new beginnings that exceeded anything she'd imagined possible during her supposedly successful corporate career. The fight against age discrimination would continue long after my own involvement ended, but I'd played a role in ensuring that other workers wouldn't have to face the same challenges alone and without support. The infrastructure we'd built, the policies we'd changed, and the attitudes we'd shifted would benefit countless people who would never know our names but would live and work in a more equitable society because we'd refused to accept injustice as inevitable. That legacy felt like the most fitting response to the executives who'd tried to discard me based on their assumptions about age and value. They'd intended to eliminate a liability, but had instead created an advocate whose impact far exceeded anything they'd achieved through their systematic discrimination. The morning I'd walked out of Meridian Financial with my belongings in boxes, I'd felt like my career was ending. Now I understood it had really been beginning. The most important work of my professional life had started at 64, proving that retirement should be a choice made by individuals based on their own priorities and capabilities, not a sentence imposed by others based on arbitrary assumptions about aging and worth. Looking ahead, I could see years of continued advocacy, writing, and mentoring work that would extend my impact far beyond traditional retirement age. The forced retirement that was supposed to end my career had instead taught me that the most meaningful work often begins when others assume your productive years are finished. That lesson, perhaps more than any policy change or legal victory, represented the true triumph over the age discrimination that had tried to define my limitations. By refusing to accept those limitations, I'd discovered possibilities that conventional thinking about aging and careers could never have imagined. The story wasn't ending. It was evolving into something larger and more significant than revenge or justice for a single individual. It had become a movement that would continue long after any one person's involvement, carried forward by everyone who understood that experience and wisdom were assets to be leveraged rather than liabilities to be eliminated. That understanding represented the ultimate victory over the corporate executives who'd tried to discard me, and the systematic practices that continued to waste America's most experienced workers. They'd lost not just a legal battle or public relations war, but the broader argument about value, dignity, and the contributions that people of all ages could make when given the opportunity to do so. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.